So last time, like we were live when we thought we weren't live yet, so it was recording. So this may be, yeah,
Did we
exactly.
did,
We just got that expression.
did we
Yep.
did we did we say anything
No, we
that
didn't.
needs to get
We
cut?
didn't say anything. No, but just a reminder to not. It's a lie. Okay, now it says we are officially live, so we really can't say anything. All right. Um. All right. Well, let's go. Welcome to another episode of the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. Once again, we are coming to you live on Substack. Not surreptitiously this time, but announced in advance. Uh, so hopefully we'll see some folks coming in, and if you guys want to utilize the chat at all, you can do so. I'm here as usual with my clarifying co-host, Dr. Tommy Wood. How's it going, Tommy?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good. Um, we've got a juicy topic today, so we probably should get right into it. No idle chit chat. And this one comes from listener Carol. She actually sent it in by voice. So I'm going to try to play it. Hopefully people can hear it. I'll play her question for you.
Oh, as I was borderline high. Finally, my doctor said that I need to definitely moved the needle for me down, but not enough to get my LDLs below 100. My question to you, how do statins affect the brain? Am I better off going on statins and avoiding cholesterol going into my brain, which may cause problems? Thanks in advance.
Thank you, Carol, for the question and the kind words. So to recap, her cholesterol has been borderline high over the years, and her doctor is advising a statin. Sounds like wants it under 100. We don't know what her numbers are. We don't know if she's got vascular disease. I'm presuming, based on the question, that the answer to that's no. But I'll set the stage a little bit and then turn it over to Tommy. So this is a super challenging topic, and it's challenging for a lot of different reasons. There's a reason that people have so many questions and concerns about it because it's really hard to get definitive answers, and it seems like every expert has kind of their own unique take. So I'll try to first kind of frame the issues here broadly, beyond her question, and the controversies that have turned this topic into such a hot mess. So on one side of the spectrum, you have people who say that cholesterol is the cause of vascular disease, known as the cholesterol hypothesis, and that we should put statins in the drinking water. And I know several physicians who think like that. On the other side, there are those who say that cholesterol has zero to do with heart disease, that the cholesterol hypothesis is a lie, and that statins are poisons. And there are intelligent and informed people on both sides and everywhere in between. And then trying to find out what's true is compounded further by the fact that there are some powerful perverse incentives that influence people on either side of the spectrum. So the pharmaceutical industry obviously has a big incentive for the cholesterol hypothesis to be true and for statins and cholesterol lowering drugs to be seen as effective. While on the other end, there's always an incentive to say things that contradict the mainstream position, because that's a great way to get attention. And we live in a world where winning people's attention has become the most important thing for many people. And that incentive just keeps getting stronger, which is why we're all swimming in an ever-growing sea of misinformation. And there's lots of scaremongering and unsupported claims that are made on both sides of the spectrum. But just because those motivations exist, it doesn't make those arguments wrong. Even though both sides in this debate will make that claim, dismiss the other's argument based on the source rather than the validity of the argument. Ultimately, what matters is the science and the evidence, which is what we try to focus on here on the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. Another thing that makes this super confusing is that there are multiple different controversial issues that are baked into these discussions and that are often being debated simultaneously, which further contributes to the confusion. So the usefulness of statins, the mechanisms of statins, so why they actually help reduce vascular risk if they indeed do, the validity of the cholesterol hypothesis, the validity of cholesterol testing, the interpretation of cholesterol testing numbers, the intervention you do based on cholesterol testing, depending on context and the patient. And these are each kind of distinct issues, and your view on any one of them doesn't have to necessarily correlate with your view on any other. And so each person with some expertise in this area may have differing opinions on each of those various topics. So the controversy or the debate isn't just around two different positions, it's around a whole host of positions at the same time. But people may not realize that's going on because it's often not explicit. So Tommy is going to clear all of this up for us and wrap it up in a neat little bow, hopefully in 15 minutes or less. Are you ready?
Not now. So thanks for that, and thanks for the
better you than me.
Thanks for the context. I will say that what I'm going to largely focus on is, I think, the evidence as it currently stands, particularly when it comes to statins in the brain and dementia risk, because I think that's where a lot of the question comes from. That, therefore, I'm not necessarily going to dive a bunch into mechanisms and hypotheses, because while I think that's interesting and important, that's that doesn't necessarily matter, right? So,
right.
In terms of what somebody should actually do. So to kind of start with all of this, I think there are a few things that can mention. So so we've talked a few times about the Livingston Commission, sort of ostensibly under the Lancet, publishes these sort of big overarching papers on the proportion of dementia that may be preventable due to modifiable factors. It was first released in 2020. When they updated it in 2024, they added LDL cholesterol as a modifiable risk factor, which they hadn't had in the previous edition. Currently, they do something called PAF's, population attributable fraction. So, like, what proportion of dementia may be preventable if you treat or completely remove one particular risk factor. For LDL cholesterol, it was 7%. So it's actually they now have decided it's one of the most important risk factors for dementia prevention. The big sort of changing point in those 4 years, where there were a number of large population studies that came out that looked at LDL cholesterol and dementia risk. And it's worth saying that most of the evidence is for cholesterol levels in midlife. So the relationship between elevated LDL cholesterol, and I'll go a little bit more into some of like what those different things mean. Elevated LDL cholesterol, sort of once you get past 65, 70, the risk seems to be lower. And actually that's the case for most diseases, like including cardiovascular disease. Often once you get into your 60s, 70s, 80s, actually LDL cholesterol is associated with longevity, but that's probably just because you're a person, or at least part of it is because you're a person who's just not going to get heart disease from elevated cholesterol, because that's not everybody is. And so particularly midlife cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, seems to be a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, for dementia, and cardiovascular disease. But there was one study, say, that they cited in the Livingston paper. It was a big study done with health records in the UK, nearly 900,000 people. They looked at individuals who were actually in this particular paper, they were 65 and older, and those who had an LDL cholesterol above 120 milligrams per deciliter, or 3 millimoles per liter, had an elevated risk of dementia. And then there were several other studies now, including potentially millions of people, again, finding that higher LDL cholesterol in midlife was associated with an increased risk of later dementia. So this was what prompted the Livingston Commission to now add this as a modifiable risk factor. the thing that I guess I wanted to sort of frame a lot of the conversation around, and this is really where the answer is going to come down to, is the fact that what we see at the population level isn't necessarily what we see at the individual level. And we need to kind of separate those things out. And that is where a lot of the confusion comes from. So it's easiest to frame this in terms of cardiovascular disease. There's just a huge body of data that shows that at the population level, higher LDL cholesterol is associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. You could do that with observational studies. You can do that with Mendelian randomization studies, which is there are lots of different genetic polymorphisms that result in slight changes in LDL cholesterol. And basically, your genetic LDL cholesterol correlates with your risk of cardiovascular disease. And I think now we can kind of say that at the population level, that is a very strong signal. Like that is absolutely there. And so that is sort of the grounding for the cholesterol hypothesis. I think there is then some people might question, well, like, why is this, like, what is even happening there? So that can kind of brings us to what these different things mean. So LDL cholesterol as a measure is the amount of cholesterol in LDL particles, which are lipid particles, the particles that are there to move fat essentially around the body. And as part of that, they have cholesterol. When we're thinking about cardiovascular disease, and this is important because the majority of dementias have a vascular component. So even though Alzheimer's disease is sort of traditionally thought to be, more amyloid and tau and that kind of stuff we've talked about several times before, the majority of Alzheimer's cases do have evidence of vascular disease if you actually look at the brain. And then you have vascular dementia on top, which is a separate entity supposedly, but in fact, there's a vascular component to probably the majority of dementias. And this is why it's thought that LDL cholesterol and lipids become important here, because they can create atherosclerosis within the arteries that affects blood flow into the brain. It affects vascular function throughout the brain, which we know is really critical. So LDL cholesterol is, as you measure on a blood test, is just a proxy for the number of LDL particles, because each LDL particle has approximately some number of cholesterol particles in there, and they're sort of directly correlated. In metabolic disease, these things do become what we call discordant. So you have less LDL cholesterol for a given number of LDL particles. You have like smaller, denser particles that have less cholesterol. But for most people, LDL cholesterol is a proxy for LDL particles. LDL particles are the most important pool, or the largest pool, of ApoB containing lipoproteins, which is what we actually care about. That's sort of like the primary risk factor when it comes to lipids and cardiovascular disease. So ApoB containing lipoproteins also include other like precursors to LDL particles, like VLDL particles. It also includes things like LP little a, lipoprotein little a. And then all of these together are sort of like the, any lipid particle that has an ApoB in it, and there's just like one per particle. These are the ones that seem to be able to enter into the sort of like the lining of the arteries and then cause atherosclerosis. There's probably some other steps involved in that process. They don't just like enter in and start to accumulate, because we know that a healthy artery has like a sort of a protective layer inside of it called the glycocalyx, which becomes impaired with things like high blood pressure, potentially high blood sugar. And so, metabolic health probably plays a role in sort of that side of it. And also, if you look at things like autopsy studies where people have tracked what the progression of atherosclerosis looks like across sort of like the full spectrum of the disease, it seems that before lipids start to accumulate, there's some changes in the vascular wall, which again are probably going to be related to things like blood pressure, nutrient status, homocysteine may play a role. So it's not just the ApoB containing lipoproteins, but sort of probably those exist in a greater system that is associated with worse vascular function. So particularly when you look at the population level, high ApoB or high LDL cholesterol is associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease. But in most studies, this is done in the United States or the UK, where the majority of people have some kind of metabolic dysfunction. Like the average adult has some degree of prediabetes or hypertension, or at least they're on that spectrum. So these are important at the population, absolutely. But what that means for the individual is much trickier. And this is clear because we know that you don't just treat one person with high cholesterol with a statin and automatically prevent a heart attack, right? There's something called a number needed to treat. So how many people you need to treat with a statin in order to prevent a major cardiovascular event. And, you know, it's dozens of people. So we need to appreciate that if we're looking at this stuff at the full population level, trying to decrease the overall burden of dementia, it absolutely makes sense to consider cardiovascular risk and LDL cholesterol and have that be part of that process, because again, at the population level, when you're talking hundreds of thousands of people, there are going to be some individuals where their level of LDL cholesterol is a primary causative factor in their dementia. There's some sort of circumstantial evidence that this has already been the case. So there are now several population studies in the US and Europe, and they were entered into a recent big meta-analysis that looked at the progression of dementia risk over the past 2 or 3 decades. And what they found, and this is kind of contrary, I think we've talked about this before, but it's sort of contrary to most of the messaging that you get right now. But at any given age nowadays, you are less likely to be diagnosed with dementia than you were 20 or 30 years ago. And the current best hypothesis for why that's the case is because there's been such a large focus on preventing heart disease. Of course, that's not just treatments with statins, but it's blood pressure medication. It's metformin in diabetes and prediabetes. It's helping people stop smoking. And all of those together are probably decreasing cardiovascular risk, and then that's decreasing dementia risk. And statins play a role there because they've become very commonly prescribed drugs. What's interesting is that both sexes seem to benefit, but the benefit in terms of the risk reduction that's happened over the past few years may be slightly higher in men. And again, that supports this heart disease or cardiovascular risk idea, because men in general are a higher cardiovascular disease risk. We've, like, as a population, we've focused on that, and it's worked. It's decreased overall age-specific incidence of dementia, but may have had a greater benefit in men. So there are all these kind of pieces that come together that say that when you're looking really big picture, LDL cholesterol as a proxy for ApoB-containing lipoproteins, is probably an important part of dementia risk. But you would need to treat potentially dozens or hundreds of people before in order to prevent one case of dementia. And that's probably a little unfair of me to say, because right now there's no guideline. Oh, actually, and the formal guidelines say that statins should not be used for dementia prevention. They're used for cardiovascular disease prevention, and then as a side effect, they may have a benefit in terms of dementia, which isn't sort of certain yet. There are a couple of meta-analyses that have looked at secondary analyses of some statin trials that didn't find an effect of statins on dementia one way or the other. But there are 2 trials ongoing, at least, Preventable and Starry, looking at statin treatment. So I think they're both using 40 milligrams of atorvastatin in individuals either 70 or 75 and older, and looking at survival without disability. And one of the disabilities they'll be looking at is dementia. So right now, there's nothing that says you should take a statin or you should lower your cholesterol specifically for dementia prevention, because the evidence just isn't that strong yet. It all comes from observational population studies. But if you're decreasing your cardiovascular risk, you're probably almost certainly decreasing your dementia risk. And so there's a difference between saying you can definitely prevent something and saying I'm doing everything to minimize my risk. When you think about cardiovascular risk more broadly, the two things that stand out consistently, I think, from the literature in terms of cardiovascular risk factors that also particularly increase the risk of dementia, the two most important ones are blood pressure and blood sugar. So cholesterol, absolutely important. But when you look at all these individual components, there's much better evidence for blood pressure management and dementia risk, and for blood sugar management and dementia risk. So all of this needs to kind of fit into the bigger picture. There are several meta-analyses looking at population studies, and now sort of like there was one that came out earlier this year. 7 million people, I think, looking at the effect of statins on dementia risk. In general, when you look at these observational studies, these are not randomized controlled trials, but in general, it seems that compared to not taking a statin, if you have elevated cholesterol, taking a statin is associated with a lower risk of dementia. And it seems to be a time-dependent effect. So you only see it once people are on the medication for several years. So just like being prescribed it isn't enough. You need to consistently take it. Again, this is observational data. It's not like a randomized controlled trial, but that it's this kind of information that which is why the Livingston Commission said that LDL cholesterol was a modifiable risk factor for dementia. What's another interesting thing, and this kind of comes to your mechanism. I said I wouldn't talk too much about mechanism, but in previous meta-analyses that were slightly smaller, and then again in this bigger one, there seems to be a bigger effect of statins on Alzheimer's disease risk than vascular dementia risk, which is slightly counterintuitive because you're like, well, if it's a vascular thing and it's all happening in the arteries, then surely vascular dementia would be the one that you're preventing. But I think that probably comes down to some of the other effects that statins can have. So they certainly have an anti-inflammatory effect, and they can decrease cardiovascular disease in individuals who don't have elevated cholesterol but do have elevated levels of inflammation. And because inflammation plays a really big role in Alzheimer's disease, it may be a cholesterol mediated effect of statins that's driving some of the signal. But again, this is not randomized trials. This is just big sort of observational data. Other things that are worth taking into account, and this is where I think some of the questions will come from. Like there's this, so the FDA, more than a decade ago, released a warning that some individuals may experience cognitive symptoms or brain fog when taking a statin. Since then, when you look at these big meta-analyses of side effects of statins in big clinical trials, not much of a signal of that has been seen. So I've even seen people debating, like, is this even a common side effect of statins? So it's not that it doesn't happen, it's just that it's not very common. Like there are much more common side effects of statins, like muscle pain and muscle fatigue. And those are very well documented. So there's this hypothetical idea that for some people, they may experience some change to their cognitive function or some cognitive symptoms after starting a statin, but from everything I can find, it's luckily relatively rare. For those who experience muscle pain or muscle fatigue, you obviously have a couple of options. One is you can take a different medication, and there are an increasing number of options now. And this is again if you're choosing to medicate in order to decrease your risk. So ezetimibe, benzoic acid, PCSK9 inhibitors, if those are indicated, they're very expensive. And you can obviously do a combination. So there are some studies where you have some ezetimibe and then you can take a lower dose of a statin. Then you have fewer, potentially, if you're somebody who has side effects. There's, one of the reasons why people think that you get some of these side effects is because statins inhibit the production of CoQ10, which is important for mitochondrial function, so energy production. And at least for muscle symptoms, supplementing with, there are randomized controlled trials of supplementing with CoQ10 100 to 600 milligrams a day that seems to offset some of those muscle symptoms in those taking a statin. And I found at least one case report where somebody reported cognitive changes after starting a statin. They then supplemented with CoQ10, and the cognitive symptoms went away. But this is just like one small case study. So that could be the reason why that's happening. So in reality, this is a tricky question to answer, because you need to take all of these things into account, I think. So if you're at high cardiovascular risk, there are risk calculators, there are risk treatment guidelines, then I think medication is absolutely worth considering. And that's something that I would recommend, because decreasing cardiovascular risk certainly seems to decrease dementia risk. However, taking statins specifically for dementia prevention is not something that we currently know, or currently that we have good evidence for. So it's all going to come down to your individual kind of risk tolerance and discussions with your doctor about what you think is most important. So right at the top in the question, we had some question that you mentioned, lifestyle measures. So obviously physical activity, important for everything that we've mentioned. So improving physical activity improves cholesterol levels, improves blood pressure, improves blood sugar. You can do dietary things. So probably the one food that's best at increasing LDL cholesterol is butter, even above and beyond other saturated fats. So you can do some tinkering with your diet. Increasing dietary fiber decreases LDL cholesterol levels in general. So there are a lot of things that you could continue to try beyond, before you considered medication. So I think there's no real perfect answer there. It all comes down to like what's your risk and what's your risk tolerance, and how do you want to address these things. I'm just remembering another study that came up, and actually there's a question. One of the first questions that came up, somebody asked about rosuvastatin in ApoE4, and actually there's a very nice study that addresses that specifically. So this was published in 2020. It was a large randomized controlled trial done in China, more than 1,000 people, and in I think it was adults 60 years and older who had high blood pressure. They were randomized either to rosuvastatin, so that's Crestor, then an angiotensin receptor 2 antagonist, telmisartan, or both, or control group got neither. And what was interesting is that there seemed to be synergy between the blood pressure medication and the statin in terms of decreasing cognitive decline. But rosuvastatin, specifically in those who are ApoE4 positive, seemed to have significant benefit in this randomized controlled trial. So, if that aligns for you, because that aligned for that one particular person in terms of their question, that's, again, there is something where we have a randomized controlled trial where there's some potential, evidence for benefit there, and we can provide that link. The final thing that I'll mention is that when you're trying to do your own sort of risk stratification, I think some imaging could be helpful. Now, traditional treatment guidelines won't say you should go and image the arteries in your heart, right? Get a coronary artery calcium score or a CT angiogram, right? In general, they would recommend that you just take a medication. However, I think we now have a ton of studies showing that really the best predictor of a future cardiovascular event is how the arteries in your heart look. And how the arteries in your heart look probably tracks pretty closely with how the arteries in your brain looks. So I think it's certainly worth considering something like a coronary artery calcium score, or the gold standard is a CT angiogram, but that requires a CT scan. There's X-rays involved. It's not something you want to do a lot of. And well, that is the case for the coronary artery calcium score as well, but the risk is lower. So if you're trying to figure out what's my risk, where should I be trying to target, or what should I be trying to do? Then, consider blood pressure, blood sugar, other lifestyle factors. Consider something like some imaging to see, like, well, what do my arteries, actually look like? Am I at increased risk? And then, sort of put that all together and figure out, would you want to consider a medication? And again, I think the focus should be on cardiovascular risk reduction, with a potential benefit for dementia prevention, because right now, we can't really be certain that will be the case. I think some people are asking about targets here. So when you look at some of these studies, I mentioned one earlier where a cutoff of 120 milligrams per deciliter was associated with a higher risk of dementia. These, that's probably a little bit lower than most people would consider to be like the most important, like, high risk target for LDL reduction for cardiovascular disease. And I'll say up front that whenever you get these cutoffs from these studies, they're essentially pretty arbitrary, because they're based on like quartiles or quintiles of the population. So, the bottom 75% are under this cutoff. So we're going to look at those with the 25% highest level. And then that leaves you susceptible to the effects of big outliers and that kind of stuff. But that was a cutoff that was kind of mentioned in the Lancet Commission, was 120 milligrams per deciliter or 3 mL per liter. Looking at ApoB, there was a study in the UK Biobank that found that those who had an ApoB level above 118 milligrams per deciliter, which is 1.18 grams per liter, if you're in the UK, that was associated with an increased risk of later dementia in adults who are sort of 40 to 70 years old. That level of ApoB, that's probably considered like a sort of like a high risk target. So if your ApoB level was up there, if you measured it, then that's probably something that a cardiologist would recommend treating with the medication. So those are kind of, potentially some cutoffs there. But like I said, I think that in general, they're fairly arbitrary just based on how the study was designed. So I wouldn't take those like too seriously. And again, I would put all of that in sort of context of the other things that we've thought about and talked about. I've rambled for a long time, Josh. So what haven't I covered? What needs more clarification? What other thoughts do you have that we can dig into? And are there any questions? I haven't really been following the questions as I talked. So is there anything else that we can address?
I think everything's pretty cut and dried. We've covered it all. So I think one of the issues is, first of all, great. I mean, it covered a lot of the super important stuff here. I think one of the issues is that people think that, so you've laid out, there's evidence to support use in certain situations for sure. And there's a tendency to think if a little bit is good, a lot is better. So you see a lot of doctors being more aggressive than the guidelines on this issue, and having, a different threshold for when they should be used. So, and I think perhaps that could be in the original question part of what's going on. And I think one of the things to make clear is that the sort of the two buckets we first think about is when in terms of like statin prescribing in particular, is this someone who has any established vascular disease? You mentioned that there's data on dementia, but there's not any indication presently for using it for dementia risk, right? So we're still, in terms of clinical guidelines, they're all centered around vascular disease. So primary prevention is around whether or not they have established vascular disease or risk factors, and that determines where the cutoffs are in the numbers. So the primary prevention is you have no disease, no known vascular disease, and then secondary prevention is you have known vascular disease, you had a heart attack, you've had a stroke. In that situation, statins are already recommended regardless of LDL levels. But for primary prevention, the current guidelines are, I believe, if you no diabetes, no other risk factors, LDL over 190 to treat. So if you go to the doctor and you get your LDL tested and it's over 190, what are you doing in your particular situation?
So I would. Well, actually, the first thing that I would do is I would get some kind of formal imaging to
Mhm.
actually understand how far into the disease process I am, if I am at all. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion has come from, because even though, again, this is where we have to be like really careful what we're talking about at the population level. People who have an LDL above 190 are at higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Like,
Right.
that's,
Right.
we know that
If you blanket treat every person the same way
Mm.
on the population level, you are going to reduce risk
Yeah,
by adopting that protocol. That is true.
yeah,
That's the issue we're running up against here. Is
yeah,
that is true, but what do you do? That still doesn't change. What you do at an individual level can be different. And
yeah,
so
exactly.
keep
Yeah.
going.
So then I would probably get a CT angiogram. If I couldn't get a CT angiogram, I get coronary artery calcium score, and then some. There are some tools now available to kind of get more information on, because a coronary artery calcium score only looks at calcified plaque, whereas non-calcified and sort of intermediate plaque, which sort of softer plaque, is actually the higher risk plaque. So a coronary artery calcium score doesn't tell you about the atherosclerotic plaque that's very high risk for causing a heart attack. But it's sort of those who have more calcified plaque tend to have more uncalcified plaque. So they're kind of, again, they're kind of related to one another. But I would get a CT angiogram, and if I had, any notable atherosclerotic plaque, I would medicate. Absolutely.
And if you would you use your other cholesterol testing numbers at all to guide that decision, or would you just base it on the imaging?
Yeah, so this is where I think some of the questions that have come up,
Mhm.
play a role. So, there's questions like, so you can look at cholesterol synthesis markers, like things like desmosterol, and you can get these from Boston Heart. Um, the It's possible that some of the people who, if they do experience cognitive symptoms or cognitive issues when they start a statin, is that they've been too aggressive. If it's a lipophilic statin, you may be completely, disrupting cholesterol synthesis in the brain, which is important for, structure and function. These are sort of like hypothetical risks, but certainly when you hear people who are doing this day in, day out, they have seen individual cases, certainly where this might be the case. So I would get, and sort of like, I'm right now, I know I can get a very expensive, fancy, expanded cholesterol panel. I can get additional imaging. I can sort of make this like a very personalized risk assessment. And so based on all of that, I would probably track those things. So I would also get an LP little a, because LP little a is largely genetically determined. It probably does move due to some other factors, but it's largely genetically determined, and it forms part of your ApoB, but it doesn't respond to statins necessarily. So some people are now suggesting that, if you have an elevated LP little a, you might be more aggressive in terms of your treatment because you're trying to overcome this additional genetic risk that you might have. And there is some evidence that higher LP little a is associated with a higher dementia risk, or a fast cognitive decline. So that I would take all of those things into account. I would, if I had established risk, I would certainly start medication. A statin, probably a statin plus ezetimibe, so you can have a lower statin dose and get the same LDL lowering effect. I would then track some of those other numbers to figure out how aggressive I might need to be. And of course, then think about all the other things that are important for my cardiovascular risk. So particularly blood pressure, blood sugar, kind of fit those back into the bigger picture. And then if I saw a significant drop in some of these cholesterol synthesis numbers, if we'd sort of been like maybe too aggressive up front, you can kind of tinker with that to sort of just make sure that you're not maybe sort of like right at the edge of your biology, sort of really inhibiting some processes that are important. If I took a statin, I would take CoQ10 at the same time. I think it's a low risk with potential for benefit. Yeah, that's what I would do.
Somebody asked about, it just reminded me, it's by the way, it's a little tricky to monitor the comments the way this app is set up, right?
Yeah.
So, but I did see one plop go by about the use of plant sterols, and for lowering LDL, I think so. I've seen a little bit of data on that. It looked pretty good. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I know less about that in this context. I think some people are. I think some people have questioned whether it manipulates the numbers on the blood test, but doesn't actually improve cardiovascular risk. And I think that's kind of where I've ended up, is that it can make your blood test look better, but it may not actually then translate to any improvement in risk.
We don't know, right?
Yeah.
All right. And so based on what you've said too, would you, it sounds like that you would say that you think that the association between elevated LDL and dementia risk is still likely mediated by its effects on vascular health. Would you say would you say that you believe that to be true?
Yeah, I think that's as far as we can tell. Certainly, there might be other things playing a role. So, when we think about other, the interaction with other risk factors, so ApoE genotype being an example, ApoE4 changes cholesterol handling in the brain. So it could be that it's how actually cholesterol within the cells themselves is being handled is part of the risk there, and that's why taking a statin could be, and again, could be beneficial. I'm talking, referencing that, one study where they looked at a subgroup of people with ApoE4, they took rosuvastatin, they seemed to have cognitive protection. It could be having an extravascular effect by changing cholesterol handling more broadly, which is something that is impacted by ApoE4 genotype.
And then the last thing I was gonna ask you about was, so we're talking about, a hypothetical scenario and what other information you'd want. So you tend to look at, LDL cholesterol, but also triglycerides and HDL, and that, that ratio, is if those numbers are good, then, in the context of a higher LDL, it's going to suggest your risk is lower. However, would that change your decision making in that hypothetical scenario in any way? Or if you're going to be doing the imaging, because is that really just predicting what your imaging is going to be? And then what your imaging is going to be is really dictating what your decision is. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I think that kind of additional information is useful particularly useful if you're not going to get imaging. Mm-hmm. So there are several observational studies that look at cardiovascular risk within different levels of LDL, within different levels of, say, metabolic health. So triglyceride to HDL being one of those potential markers. So those who have a low triglyceride to HDL ratio tend to have better insulin sensitivity. And within those who have a low triglyceride to HDL ratio, the relationship between or they have less of an increase in risk of cardiovascular disease if their LDL is elevated, if that makes sense. There were also, in some of the original statin trials, so like in the 4S trial, they did a secondary analysis where they separated individuals by triglyceride to HDL ratio. And in those, the benefit was greater in terms of cardiovascular risk reduction in those who had a high triglyceride to HDL ratio, who probably had some degree of insulin resistance. So there has been a lot of consternation, say, in low carb and like keto groups about this, because often if you're in good overall health and physically active and you go on a ketogenic diet, your LDL cholesterol can go up quite significantly. And therefore, and I wasn't sure I was going to talk about this, but I'm talking about it now. So therefore, there's long been this idea that your LDL levels matter much less if you're in good metabolic health. And you can see some of this from population data. Like I said, you can see this from some of the previous statin trials. So several years ago, I helped to set up a study to look at this. And I'm not an expert in. I've talked about some of this stuff right now, but I am not an expert in cardiovascular disease, either imaging or risk. I sort of I know enough, I think, to talk about it here, but it's not my area of expertise. But this question I thought was important enough that there should be some kind of study around it. Because some people would just say LDL matters regardless of context, whereas I think just if you look at the literature as a whole, it just has to be more complicated than that. We know that. So anyway, this study was set up. It was run at the Lundquist Institute, which is an expert institute in LA. Matt Budoff is the PI. 100 people who had diet-induced elevations in LDL cholesterol above 190, so above that high-risk threshold. They had documented evidence that they were below it before they went on a ketogenic diet, and then they went above that threshold before, after that. And some of these people had very high elevations in LDL cholesterol. Like we're talking 500, 600, 700, really high. And these individuals came in, had baseline coronary artery, so CT angiograms, so gold standard testing, and then they were followed for a year to kind of see progression of atherosclerotic plaque. The sort of first follow-up data were published recently. There's been a lot of discussion about how good that paper was. I agree with most of the concerns about the paper, even though my name is on it. But basically, what the study showed was that in these individuals who were in good metabolic health otherwise, very high levels of LDL cholesterol, their level of LDL cholesterol or ApoB level did not correlate with how fast their atherosclerotic plaque progressed. What the best predictor of progression was how much plaque they had to start with. So that's why I was saying I would just get imaging and I would know where I stand. And this study kind of helped sort of reiterate that in my mind, because even though these people were in good metabolic health, some of them had very significant plaque progression within a year. So they weren't protected from plaque progression just because they were in good metabolic health. Like that was the way that I interpreted it. But it was very heterogeneous. So some people had no progression, some people had a lot. And, despite really picking a very select group, people who were very healthy, had been on a ketogenic diet for long periods of time, some of them did have quite significant, very high risk progression in a year. There's been some discussion about the data. So the data have been analyzed in different ways, and one of the ways that the data were analyzed doesn't quite agree with the others. And in reality, so one basically said everybody progressed, and then multiple other ways say, well, actually not everybody. Some people even regressed a little bit, and then some people progressed, and then most people just didn't really change that much. So there's a bit of a question in terms of exactly what was happening in the arteries of these people, because that's actually quite difficult to really figure out. You need you can do this by eye, you can do it with machine learning algorithms. All the algorithms are different. But anyway, all of this to say that yes, there's we kind of think that if you're in very good health, your risk due to an elevation in LDL cholesterol is less than it would be if you weren't in good health, right? For the same level of LDL cholesterol. I think that's fair to say. But that's because all these other things play a role as well. But if you're in good health, I think we also have evidence to say that you can't just ignore the fact that you have high LDL cholesterol. You can't just say, well, I'm in really good shape, so if my cholesterol is really high, it doesn't matter. I don't think we have evidence to support that either. So I think the ultimate arbiter would be to get some kind of formal imaging or testing to know where you really stand.
Great. I was thinking one other thing as we're talking about this is LDL is, so much of the conversation revolves around that as a decision point that it leads people to believe that that is the most important thing and that all these trumps all these other factors. The
Mm.
reason is because it's the factor that's been studied the most. So that's
Yeah.
where all the evidence is around, and it's what statins impact. So that's, then that's a big reason of why we have so much data on it. So it's not because it's the most important thing. It's because that's where the most data is. And we have a lot less data on these other factors, which may drive risk more, but we don't know how to base our decision making on it because we don't have the data for it.
Yeah.
But I think I'm going to try. I think I can put together maybe a set of universal guidance, to cover all scenarios. See if you agree with this. So, number one, in terms of deciding on statin therapy, number one is be sure you're following the current guidelines, right? So we talked about one of the issues is just that that oftentimes people are being advised to start them on therapy. And then if you are in an area where there's a gray zone, the main one being you are otherwise healthy, you don't have any known vascular risk, but your levels are above the guidelines, then collect additional data, as you said, with imaging being best, if you can.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't, the odds are in your favor that taking it will hurt more than it will harm, just because of the population level data that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with all that?
Yeah, except I think you accidentally said that if you can't get additional data, taking a medication will hurt more than it will harm. Which
sorry. So
you meant help. You meant help more than it will harm.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you can't get that additional data, and you are otherwise healthy but have a LDL above the guidelines for starting a statin or primary prevention, then taking it will help. The odds are that taking it will help more than it will harm.
Yeah, I think that's right. And now, just because there's, like you said, there's so much data there, and people have looked at the benefits, the balance of risk versus benefit, and at least at the population level, you're right. The balance is in benefit, and like I said, I think we're seeing some of that in the population level data of dementia risk as well. And I didn't answer your question earlier, but it's sort of from the first point, which I agree with. I would just start by following standard guidelines. I don't think, even though hypothetically, right, you can if you look at a Mendelian randomization study where you have sort of like genetically predicted LDL level and then cardiovascular disease risk, it's essentially a straight line, which like goes through the origin, which basically says if you have 0 LDL, you have 0 cardiovascular disease risk. So that's why there's this hypothetical idea that just like the lower you can get it, the better.
Right.
I would argue that we just don't have evidence for that. That's never been tested in a trial. When you're looking at people who have very, very low LDL levels, due to genetics, there's probably they're quite rare. There's a whole bunch of other things going on. So I don't think that there's evidence for really, really aggressive LDL lowering. Most of the evidence is for treatment in individuals at high risk. High risk includes a whole bunch of other factors as well. And in that kind of scenario, it would certainly make sense, at least to start following the guidelines. If you can get more information about your own individual risk, your current disease state, that would be ideal. But it's safe to say that in general, those kinds of guidelines are probably the best place to start.
Right, yeah, we could have an entirely different podcast on what targets should be, right, in these different scenarios. The whole other can of worms. All right, well, I think that's good enough for one episode. Thanks all for who joined us live. If we missed your question, or if you have another question that pops up, you feel free to send it our way. You can click the link if you're listening to this on the podcast description. You can also just respond or send us a message through Substack or respond or a comment on the post. Or you can go to brainjoe.academy/questions and ask your questions there. There's also the link to submit them by voice if you want to do that, like Carol did. Okay, well, and thanks to Carol for her question that got the ball rolling on this one. I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk about this. And thank you, Tommy, for the excellent response.
Thanks, thanks, Carol, as well. Thanks everybody for listening. Yeah, see you next time.
All right, we'll see you guys hopefully live again in maybe a couple weeks. All right, bye everyone.
Bye.